steadily developed its economy following the devastation of World War I, was beginning to realize its good run was about to end. Starting with a significant fall in land prices in 1991, the country was staring at what is now recognized as the implosion of the Japanese asset price bubble, a devastating crash in commodities that would dominate the country for much of the next decade. A similar story was unfolding in South America, which was still recovering from the Latin American debt crisis, an episode where countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina found themselves unable to pay back the immense volume of external debt they had racked up to finance their domestic industrial programs, leading to a prolonged period of economic and political turbulence in these countries. And finally, as a turbulent year wound up, the biggest shock arrived in December 1991. The USSR, a key friend and partner of India in the global order, was dissolved, and a single federation split overnight into 15 independent nations. Consumed by its own dramatic metamorphosis, what remained of this former bloc, as the Russian Federation under newly minted President Boris Yeltsin, was naturally far more preoccupied with salvaging the economic devastation it was still reeling from and removing the cobwebs of communism that had brought it there, than with recapturing the space it had abdicated in the global order. If the global theater, therefore, was in a state of flux, economic and political, then the domestic situation in India at the time was even more grave. As many know, on the 21st of May 1991, India was brutally robbed of one of her great and most promising sons when a suicide bomber took the life of Rajiv Gandhi just as he was set to address an election rally in Sriperumbudur. This tragic event, a terrible repeat of what happened to Srimati Indira Gandhi only 7 years earlier, sent shockwaves across the country and plunged the entire nation into mourning. As if the devastating impact of this tragedy weren't enough, the fact is that it took place at a time when our nation was confronted by a number of other seemingly insurmountable challenges. Somebody muted me, sorry. It took place at a time when our nation was confronted by a number of other seemingly insurmountable challenges. As a great editorial in The Economist at the time put it, the bomb that killed Rajiv Gandhi this week sent its blast through an India already on the edge of tragedy. That is why a single act of political barbarism in the southern town of Sriperumbudur on the night of May 21st. Sorry, somebody amongst the hosts are continuing to mute me. Can you please stop doing that when I'm speaking? Otherwise, you will not be able to hear me. The host is muting me repeatedly. Please stop. In the southern town of Sriperumbudur on the night of May 21st, may yet smash the world's biggest democracy into sectarian fragments. To many, that implosion seemed imminent. Politically, the stability of the country was all but hanging by a thread, with the coalition governments cobbled together by VP Singh, which only lasted from December 89 to November 90, and Chandrasekhar from November 90 to June 91, barely each lasting months before fizzling out. Challenges to national unity and security were gaining momentum in Assam, Punjab, and in Jammu and Kashmir, where Pakistan was playing an active role in fomenting strife. And finally, partly as a result of the political instability that was rampant, and certainly compounded by poor economic policy making and conflicting ideas presented by 7 finance ministers in the previous 6 years, the Indian economy was all but teetering on a precipice. As highlighted in data put together by the Center for Civil Society, the macroeconomic signals in India were all in the red. In the decade between 1981 and 91, India's external debt tripled. And in just the 2 years between 89 and 91, our trade deficit rose by 36%, from 12,400 crores to 16,900 crores. Our current account deficit rose by 54%. The rate of inflation practically doubled, from 7.5% in 89 to over 13% by 91. And in the process of footing our many bills, our foreign reserves have practically halved to just 2,000 crores by the end of 1990. As many here may remember, things got so bad that at one point India barely had the reserves to finance 3 weeks of imports. and there was a strong worry that we would end up defaulting on many of our external liabilities. With Moody's downgrading India's bond ratings, raising funds became all the more difficult, and India was forced to turn to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout by humiliatingly staking the better part of our gold reserves as collateral. Given these circumstances, it was understandable that most of the observing world was anticipating an Indian collapse, almost as if it were an inevitable reality. Pity India was how the New York Times summarized the mood in 1991. Pity India, not since independence in 1947, has so much conflict beset this huge democracy, they wrote. A violent election interrupted by the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi has left it without a majority party or a visible leader. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs are mired in quarrels. Regions clamor for self-rule. Everyone complains about corruption, the economy, and an ossified bureaucracy. If chaos triumphs in India, the tremors won't be contained. Indian disunion would be a calamity for human rights. It would fragment markets and accelerate a regional arms race fed by new rivalries, unquote. Now, today, we can say this was unnecessarily alarmist, but it wasn't just alarmism being floated by the foreign press. As some supporters of the current ruling dispensation would have been quick to argue if the same sort of reports were made today. The image of an India descending into chaos was shared by many concerned Indians as well, including the veteran journalist Raj Chengappa, who noted that there's always been a certain smugness in the way India looked at itself. The myths have been shattered one by one. Instead of a progressive and pragmatic nation, most perceive the country as a trundling rhinoceros, swathed in tons of red tape and trapped in a time warp of its own making. Given the near existential questions that were being asked of the Indian polity and what was at stake, the choice of Pamilaparthi Venkata Narasimha Rao as the 9th Prime Minister of our Republic was not greeted with much optimism across the aisle. Though a veteran administrator in a career that included a tenure as the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, as you mentioned, 7 terms as a Member of Parliament, and extensive experience in the cabinet that included stints in the crucial portfolios of external affairs, home and defense, the question of whether Sri Narasimha Rao was the man capable of leading India out of the darkness that engulfed it was one raised by many, even if it were in whispers in the capital, and perhaps understandably so. Would the scholar, intellectual, and polyglot, of whom it was uncharitably said that he was a master at being silent in 10 languages, would he meet the cold calculations and subtle political machinations of overseeing a minority government? Could a leader with no political constituency of his own, no particular caste equation in his favor, nor a mass following, manage to bring a divided India together? Was the choice of this man as Prime Minister a conniving piece of political engineering by those who wanted an amenable figure at the top in the vacuum created by Rajiv Gandhi's demise? And finally, could a man who was set on his own retirement and departure from the public sphere, in fact, he'd announced it just ahead of the election that he was retiring, could he ensure that the newly minted government would not meet a similar fate as the 2 that preceded it? These were questions raised in 1991. Over the course of the next 5 years, they were certainly met with thorough answers. In P.V. Narasimha Rao, the country was blessed with an unlikely champion who displayed his credentials as a masterful administrator and political tactician to lead India through one of its most turbulent phases. Whether it was through his capacity to implement revolutionary reforms, aided by the formidable Dr. Manmohan Singh, or through his delicate maneuvering that ensured a minority government remained in office for the full term, or by changing the very perception of India to the outside world, through his tenure in office, Sri Narasimha Rao was a force unto himself that resoundingly proved his detractors wrong. As Kapil Komireddy rightly characterizes in his excellent book, Malevolent Republic, quote, "It is now de rigueur to credit Manmohan Singh, who became finance minister in 91, with India's rapid metamorphosis. But in a country where economic isolation was an inviolable ideological axiom, Putting Singh's prescriptions into action was a distinctly political challenge. The man who shouldered this responsibility was an unlikely figure. He was 70 and had undergone triple bypass surgery when he became prime minister. A career politician, he had no political constituency of his own. There was hardly a voice that did not lament his rise to the top. And yet, if Nehru discovered India, it can reasonably be said that P.V. Narasimha Rao reinvented it, unquote. Now, don't get me wrong, both Narasimha Rao and Dr. Singh deserve every bit of praise for their contributions in liberalizing the economy. And it certainly helped that they had an extremely close partnership, which ensured that such reforms could be supported with the necessary political backing. Could a technocratic finance minister have steered such a major economic transformation without the political cover provided by a shrewd prime minister? Dr. Manmohan Singh himself does not think so. As Narasimha Rao acknowledged when speaking about his partnership with Dr. Singh, when he gets into political trouble, I bail him out. When I get into economic trouble, he bails me out. While much can be said about the economic reforms that form the crux of his reinvention, for the purpose of our discussion today, I have mentioned economics to give you the context in which Narasimha Rao had to reinvent foreign policy, because I'm offering you an analysis of the brand of foreign policy that he established during his tenure in office, and it's worth recognizing that he had to articulate a distinctly unique set of priorities emerging from these economic challenges domestically and worldwide, each of which placed the domestic development concerns of India at its core. Rao's raw political instincts and his 2 terms as foreign minister in earlier governments made him a natural in the realm of foreign policy. Vinay Sitapati, the author of a superb biography, Half Line, gives Rao credit for a realistic assessment of shifting powers, as evident in his outreach to the US, Israel, Iran, and East Asia. The new post-Cold War global environment and the weakness of Indian economy made peace a prudent choice, and reaching out to the triumphant US as the sole superpower now in a newly unipolar world, a strategic choice. He quickly won the support of the Western powers against Pakistan's promotion of terrorism and militancy in Kashmir, which was essential given the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been India's international protector. Under his sage tutelage, India was also able to surmount multiple pressures on a wide range of issues, including non-proliferation, establish diplomatic relations with Israel, launch the Look East policy for a region overlooked by previous governments, and recast the priorities of India's diplomacy from some of the alignment to the purposeful pursuit of economic interests that led to India becoming a serious independent. Narasimha Rao engineered major changes in foreign policy as India established good relations with incompatible nations like the US and Russia, Israel and the Arabs, Iran, and even Pakistan. This was first seen through his articulation of the Look East policy, which developed the foundations for closer economic ties between India and countries in Southeast and East Asia. To be sure, the prospect was not a novel proposition, but the manner in which Narasimha Rao built on the vision of closer synthesis between India and its neighbors in Asia, as described by his distinguished predecessors, is certainly worth recognizing. Many of you who have had the opportunity to read Jawaharlal Nehru's classic, The Discovery of India, would be aware of his reference to Southeast Asia as Greater India. But that heady romanticism foundered amid mutual suspicions during the Cold War, and relations remained distant. The end of the superpower standoff, and thus of the obligation of states to determine their international allegiances in relation to Cold War loyalties and commitments, widened India's foreign policy options, permitting New Delhi to look beyond the conventional wisdom of its non-aligned years. Look East followed, initially aimed at improving relations with the countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, at a time when India had embarked upon economic liberalization and indirectly at enhancing strategic cooperation with the US, looking east to look west, as the author Sunanda Datta Ray termed it, the policy remains a bedrock of Indian foreign policy today, 2 decades after it first took off. It is instructive that no Indian political party, and several have had turns at government since Narasimha Rao, has questioned either the underpinnings or the manifestations of the Look East policy. One factor helping drive the policy was undoubtedly China's early interest in the region. During the Cold War, Southeast Asia saw itself threatened by the risk of communist expansion. But once China opened up its economy to the outside world and became a major trading power, the prospects of military adventurism by Beijing receded. Nonetheless, China's growing economic and military might, for all its talk of a peaceful rise, cast a shadow over a region that had traditionally been wary of Beijing. India's interest in engaging with the region more deeply offered the nations of Southeast Asia the prospect of a democratic and non-threatening counterbalance. For years, India had been bogged down in its own neighborhood and dismissed by most, especially by Beijing, as at best a subcontinental power. Look East began with trade, but soon expanded to include diplomatic dialogue and strategic and military cooperation. It helped that both lack of historical resentments to come between them. Between 1992, Narasimha Rao made visits to Japan, responsible for the largest tranche of development assistance to India at the time, South Korea, Indonesia, and Thailand. Vietnam and Singapore followed in 94, and finally Malaysia in 95. Throughout his travels, the economic underpinnings of the message he carried to these lands was made abundantly clear. India was now open for business. And in doing business with India, these countries would find a natural partner and ally in the subcontinent, a partner with whom they'd already shared many common cultural, social, and geopolitical similarities. It was a message that was received with much optimism in these countries and formed the fulcrum through which these relationships have been further developed through successive governments in both countries. The success in purely economic terms was highlighted by Dr. Manmohan Singh when he addressed the 5th India-ASEAN Summit in January 2007 as then Prime Minister of India, when he pointed out how India's trade had risen from just 2.4 billion in 1990 before Narasimha Rao to 23 billion in 2005. And similarly, our trade with the countries of the East Asia Summit had risen from $8 billion in 1990 to 67.8 billion in 2005. This accounts for nearly 30% of our external trade, he said, and was made possible by Narasimha Rao's efforts. But the relationship is not one that has been driven by numbers alone. While trade has steadily increased over the years, in fact, today trade with ASEAN is at 81.3 billion. The potential of economic cooperation has arguably not been fully met, since services trade has still not grown commensurately. But it has certainly developed other dimensions, including in the avenues of defense cooperation, geopolitical alliances, including thriving bilateral relations and cultural exchanges. But equally, as then Prime Minister Dr. Singh recognized, the Look East policy is much more than an external economic policy. It reflects a changed understanding of India's role in the world economy and signals a significant strategic shift in India's vision of international affairs. Now, if Narasimha Rao laid the foundations for a thriving relationship with partners in the East, he was also acutely aware of the need to manage a more delicate situation closer to our borders, the challenge of the dragon. India's relations with China had at the time seen a thaw since the 1962 conflict, thanks to Rajiv Gandhi's path-breaking visit to Beijing in 1988. But the concern of Chinese incursions was a prospect that Indians could hardly afford to forget. This, coupled with the growing closeness between China and Pakistan, including through the transfer of nuclear weapon technology and allied know-how that allowed the latter to successfully become a nuclear state, meant that the Chinese relationship was one that required delicate management. China became arguably the key relationship he improved dramatically. Rao was greatly impressed with Deng Xiaoping and thought his expertise lay in giving a new direction to Chinese political philosophy without making a break with the past, something Narasimha Rao himself was doing in India. Narasimha Rao adopted a conciliatory and guarded approach towards China. Despite a cautionary note from a former Indian ambassador to China, marking democratic and pluralist ways as anathema to the visiting Chinese Prime Minister Li Peng, Rao thought that he is still the man we must do business, at least for a little more time to come. To address the principal challenge in the relationship, the disputed line of actual control, which we are all familiar with the challenges of today, Narasimha Rao displayed remarkable geopolitical dexterity in finding a mutually acceptable solution that addressed the issue by not addressing it. This came through the signing of the Agreement on the Maintenance of Peace and Tranquility along the India-China border areas during his visit to China in 1993. This was widely regarded at the time as Asia's first major agreement on conventional military disengagement. But why was it special? Through the agreement, both sides agreed to dehyphenate the issue of the contested land boundary with the rest of the relationship between the two countries. Along with a mutually agreed set of restrictions on usage of airspace and military presence in contested areas, the agreement allowed both countries to finally develop a much broader relationship by essentially sidestepping the question of the contested border. At the same time, both countries agreed to embark on confidence-building measures rooted in the principle of mutual and equal security, which allowed the countries to disengage from border contestations and move towards a more confident and assured relationship. Subsequently, the military version of these principles were also enshrined in the 1996 Agreement on Military Confidence-Building Measures. Apart from allowing India to develop closer economic ties with China, coinciding with the opening up of our economy, this agreement ensured a peaceful adherence to the status quo for a significant period of time. According to his biographer, Vinay Sitapati, the border agreements with China showed a prime minister who had learnt, perhaps from his own domestic weakness, to set aside unresolvable conflicts and focus on common interests. The veteran diplomat Shiv Shankar Menon certainly concurs. Quote, "Did the 1993 Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement serve its purpose? It certainly has in terms of keeping the peace and the status quo for almost a quarter century, and in terms of the various arrangements that have made the India-China border one of the most peaceful ones India has, until this year, of course. At a time of financial and economic stress and transition for the Indian economy, India managed to keep defense expenditures around 2.4 to 2.8% of GDP through the 1990s and into the first decade of the 21st century. The agreement was only one factor, if a major one, in making this possible. Others included the decision to become an overt nuclear weapons state in 1998. But the point is that the agreement served and was seen by others as serving India's strategic interest in peace. There were a number of other areas where the foreign policy of Shri Narasimha Rao is widely regarded as path-breaking. His pragmatism was visible in Rao's simultaneous suspicion of Pakistani intentions while keeping the conversation flowing, even while India was warding off the militancy in Kashmir financed and deployed from across the border. Relations with India's neighbors were also adroitly kept on an even keel. As part of a general reorientation of Indian foreign policy, including closer ties with the United States in 1992, the Narasimha Rao government decided to upgrade diplomatic relations with Israel to full ambassadorial level, a previously unthinkable prospect given India's close relations with the Arab world. But in Narasimha Rao, the country had a leader capable of balancing fraught identities and sensitivities through calculated moves. As Kapil Komireddy highlights, events were set into motion during the visit of influential Jewish leader Isai Leibler, who met privately with Narasimha Rao in 1991. The main request that Leibler brought with him was for India to vote in favor of upturning the upcoming UN resolution 3379, which equated Zionism with racism. Recognizing the utility of a potential partnership with Israel, India voted to repeal the resolution, despite having voted for it previously and indeed having voted against the creation of the Israeli state at the UN General Assembly way back in 1948. At the same time, Narasimha Rao made a concerted effort to reach out to India's partners in the Arab world, particularly Palestine, whose leader Yasser Arafat was invited to Delhi as a guest of the state. Through a well-reasoned deliberation with Arafat, Narasimha Rao was able to get his tacit consent, paving the way for an official upgrade in ties between India and Israel. The foundation laid in the process of these delicate plays by Narasimha Rao has certainly resulted in a very fruitful partnership. The last 2 decades have witnessed a steady strengthening of the India-Israel partnership, particularly in the defense and security areas, where the two countries' shared concerns about Islamist extremism have offered common ground for cooperation. Again, Narasimha Rao gets the credit. And that brings me to the pivotal role that Narasimha Rao played in revitalizing relations between India and the United States of America. As India opened up her economy, the need for new partners and investments was widely felt as a necessary condition to sustain and drive the economic reforms proposed by the Narasimha Rao government. With the demise of the USSR and the creation of a unipolar world order, India could hardly afford to ignore the United States, which potentially stood to offer the necessary investment and support our country now needed. But this was easier said than done. There were, after all, a number of factors that had placed obstacles in the path of this relationship. These range from Indira Gandhi's intervention in Bangladesh in 1971 over the opposition of President Nixon, to India's perceived closeness to the USSR, the nuclear question, and allegations of human rights violations in Kashmir. On India's side, the partnership between the US and Pakistan in pushing back the Soviets in Afghanistan, which involved significant military support and aid flowing into our next-door neighbor, remained a key concern, amongst others. But Narasimha Rao recognized that such misgivings of the past needed to be set aside, and a thriving relationship could help India to realize many of its domestic priorities. This is precisely what he set out and eventually managed to accomplish. After astutely managing the Indo-Israel relationship and thereby winning the support of influential Jewish lobbies in America, Narasimha Rao embarked on a path-breaking visit to the US in 1994 in a 6-day trip that included stops in New York, Houston, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Accompanied by Dr. Singh and a formidable group of established Indian business leaders, Narasimha Rao carried a common assurance into all of his meetings. India's economic reforms were here to stay, and America would do well to recognize and support the indisputable potential that was beginning to open up. Powerful players like the India Interest Group, a lobby of 26 American industrial groups interested in India, certainly helped to push the needle in the right direction. While India needed the United States on its side to keep the economic reforms going, it could not afford to give in to US pressure on non-proliferation and compromise what he saw as India's national security interests by limiting its nuclear program. Of course, this meant that during his tenure, some concessions were made by both sides. India agreed to put the brakes on any plans to conduct nuclear tests during Narasimha Rao's tenure. But he quietly kept the nuclear program going while India's economic growth, spearheaded by his economic reforms, translated into a new status which the US could not afford to ignore. In the process, he set the stage for the Vajpayee government's 1998 nuclear tests. The subtle but unmistakable progress was distinctly that of Narasimha Rao, whose mettle and self-assured demeanor would go on to surprise all who crossed his path. As the cover story in India Today noted, quote, "Clearly the most potent weapon was Rao himself. Serious, experienced, and mature, he wears the mantle of a statesman, a man who means business and is not interested in wasting unnecessary time on trivialities. In public, he comes across as a diminutive figure, his bald head and drab grey Nehru suits more appropriate to communist commissar than the leader of the world's largest emerging free market. In private meetings, however, He is in his element, giving the impression of solid confidence, flexible yet firm, a man who understands the post-Cold War scenario better than most, and more important, India's potential to play a bigger role than blinkered policies have allowed it to in the past, unquote. As the world moved away from the hubris of the Cold War era, from a period dominated by two power blocs to a world where the concept and spirit of globalization had begun to take root, India was certainly fortunate to have a leader like Narasimha Rao to guide our ship through uncharted waters. A polyglot who had mastery over no one knows how many languages. I've been looking at his biographies. The biographers all use varying numbers, 12, 15, and even 17 languages. That he had an uncanny ability to convey India's aspirations and priorities to the rest of the world, even literally speaking their language sometimes. A lovely anecdote shared by Kapil Komireddy that, and I'll quote him, that Rao remained an enigma, a man who was fluent in a dozen languages, but spoke his mind in none. Yet, visiting Havana in 1980, he received instructions from Indira to persuade the leaders of the non-aligned movement to move their next summit from Iraq, then at war with Iran, to India. What Rao did was he disarmed the gathering by arguing India's case in Spanish to the Cubans, in Persian to the Iranians, Arabic to the Iraqis and Egyptians, French to a host of African representatives, and Urdu to the Pakistanis. It's a lovely story from Kapil Komireddy. Now, throughout his tenure in office, the former Prime Minister had a remarkable commitment towards the goal of integrating India within the global order and a recognition that such an adventure was key to unlocking the inherent potential of our nation and with it, improving and creating an empowered standard of living for our people. As a masterful administrator and shrewd tactician, Narasimha Rao was an individual capable of making decisions with the full awareness of the sensitivities involved and yet driven by a determination to secure outcomes he believed stood at the core of India's national priorities. He was regarded by those who understood him as a contemporary Kautilya. Through his actions, Narasimha Rao was instrumental in unleashing a revitalized India at the turn of the 20th century. And for any cause he held dear, there was simply no obstacle large enough that could keep this titan away from securing goals he deemed important. But perhaps most important, and at the heart of his brand of leadership, lay a firm appreciation for the aspirations of the people he led and a determination to put their concerns above all else. Power for the sake of power mattered little to our Narasimha Rao, but the willingness to set aside our differences and work to liberate the spirits of our common humanity most certainly did. And I'll quote him now. Power in its conventional sense cannot be balanced when nations are dependent upon each other. We must visualize instead a world where the individual power of nations aggregates a common, collective, global power which can address itself to the resolution of problems which have consistently preoccupied the mind of man. Such power, said Narasimha Rao, must be defined not in indices of force or the strength of numbers, but by the human and material potential with which each nation is blessed. This is a speech he made in Colombo at the Sixth SAARC Summit. Under Narasimha Rao, the foreign policy of India moved decisively away from Nehruvian idealism to a more pragmatic pursuit of national self-interest. The analyst C. Rajamohan compared it to crossing the Rubicon. Yet Narasimha Rao represented continuity with India's traditional Nehruvian foreign policy approach, despite his policy deviations. With China, for instance, he de-linked the irreconcilable border dispute from other aspects of the bilateral relationship, just as he kept dialogue with Pakistan going, even while the Kashmir insurgency was raging at its peak. Significantly, for a country trying to recover from the upholding the status quo, echoed Nehru's words, and therefore won the support of die-hard Nehruvians. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's New Year card for the year 1992 read, and I quote his card, "Change is the only constant," unquote. The card depicted the sketch of a spinning wheel gradually transforming into a mechanical gear, symbolic of the evolution of tradition and not its abandonment. In that image, as we celebrate the rich foreign policy legacy of P.V. Narasimha Rao, lies the secret of his remarkable success and a reminder of all that we have to thank this underappreciated leader for. Thank you once again as we pay tribute to P.V. Narasimha Rao, and Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. It was a very comprehensive presentation about the successful foreign policy of P.V. Narasimha Rao. And you have touched upon various aspects of his life, his political, tactical leadership, and then the way he dealt with the situation, which was very turbulent when he was taking over the reins of administration. It was a very comprehensive lecture, and thank you for that. And you have really touched upon the point of his supremacy and command over 10 languages and more than that, but he preferred to be silent. It reminds me one Telugu expression, phala bhara namra padapam. It's more Sanskritized, but it means when a tree bears more number of fruits, it humbly bends. So that's what Swara is. So you have rightly pointed out his skills about language, and he was also learning computer language, and he was dealing with it. That's his wonderful interest, and he knows he wants something more to learn always. That was his personality. But your best quotes in your speech is that Nehru discovered India, but P.V. Narasimha Rao reinvented it. It's a fantastic thing. It was nicely referred to. And then the relationship of Narasimha Rao with Manmohan Singh, it was also well explained in your talk that whenever he was in economic crisis, Manmohan bailed him out. And whenever Manmohan was in political crisis, he was bailing him out. That's a real wonderful coordination. And with reference to his foreign policy, I think you are the right person to talk about, because you know very well about external affairs, being a minister in that portfolio. And you have rightly pointed out that he maintained wonderful relations with the US, Israel, Iran, Iraq, East policy, which laid a wonderful foundation for India's future relations. And you have also pointed out the consequences after him, which proved that his policy was better. That's a fantastic presentation. And you also touched upon the mettle of his statesmanship and shrewd tactician he was known for, like Kautilya. That's really a good presentation. I request you to share your text, because we have missed certain sentences because of technical issues, and maybe it will go into the treasury of PV Memorial Lectures. At one point of time, it will be part of a volume, valuable volume. I hope you will mind sharing it.
Gladly.
Thank you very much once again for your wonderful lecture, and I have seen the family members of P.V. Narasimha Rao, Vani Devi, his daughter, and P.V. Prabhakar Rao, his son, on our short list of the presenters here, the participants here, because it was live streamed across in primepost.in, an English web portal started by our senior K. Ramchandra Murthy. And then another portal, Sakalam, is a Telugu portal through which also it has been telecast. And there's a live telecasting of a YouTube channel. I hope it reaches many number of people and they'll enjoy the erudite lecture that you have presented. Thank you so much once again for you, and I present my vote of thanks. I'm doing that job also. I offer vote of thanks on behalf of the organization of P.V. Narasimha Rao Memorial Lecture, and on behalf of the family members of P.V. Narasimha Rao. And then my friend Tankasala Ashok is an editor, is a senior editor of daily newspapers. He's also hailing from Warangal. His father is a good friend of P.V. Narasimha Rao. Ashok's father's name is also Narasimha. So that's a wonderful combination that we have around. I thank all those participants, all those who have lent their ears to listen to this wonderful lecture. And I also thank the organizers, technicians, teams, and all others who supported us in successfully conducting this meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Varandal. Good evening. And thanks. Thank you very much once again. Is it okay, Murthy? Anything else to be added? if you want to say anything.
That's enough. Thank you, Ante. Thank you so much. Chala manchi dimensions. Every time I listen about any speeches about my father, it is a new dimension. And it's very nice to hear about father, isn't it? And every time I found that something new things, some new dimensions, some new descriptions. And 91 to 96, all these, again we go back and again we recollect our memories. It's nice. Thank you for arranging this.
So, Sridhar, this is
Yes.
Professor Sridharam.
Yeah, this is
Sitaram
Professor
Ravachan. Okay.
Hello, I joined late.
Sitaram Garu, honor.
How much late?
One small suggestion to you. You have said that text, however, it will be published in the volume, but why don't you get it translated into and send it to some newspaper immediately?
Yeah, first if we get the text, we can do that. Now, anyway, there are 2 web portals of our Ramchandran Murthy garu. They also can accommodate now. That can be done, but let us get it,
Shashi Tharoor.
And it is Shashi Tharoor's lecture, we can't meddle with it. we have to get a text. That's why I asked him openly, and he luckily agreed. I asked him openly to share with us.
Please ask him, and Telugu readers will be very happy to read it,
అప్పుడు తెలుగులో చేయాలి కదా మరి చేద్దాం. Once we get the text, we can do
we will get this speech translated into Telugu and published in Sakalam.in.
Thank you, sir.
That is from horse's mouth. The declaration came.
Hyderabad rangane join ayina vachi. Hyderabad, I was in travel.
ఏమంటారు?
హైదరాబాద్ పోయి వచ్చింటివి, అక్కడికి పోయి వచ్చినాక జాయిన్ అయిన, లేట్ అయింది అందుకోసం.
అవునా? ఓకే. So shall we conclude, sir?
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Samir.
Thank you.